Good Monday morning, everyone. I am David, and I am your chaplain here at Progressive, and this is this week's Monday's Motivation. If you were to walk down one of the halls at Progressive at the corporate office, you would see some plaques on the wall. We have a plaque for 10 years of service, one for 15, and we just got one put up for 20 years of service because we're coming up on our 20th year. And each one of these has names on it. The 20th one not yet, but the other two have names on them because we love celebrating people who have been faithful. And every time I go by those plaques, I just think to myself, wow, these people have been here 10 years or 15 years. These are some faithful people. They have stick-to-itiveness, right? Well, this is something that our culture struggles with right now, is faithfulness, of stick-to-itiveness. You know, in fact, I just heard this quote the other day. It was so good that I wrote it down. It's been kind of rolling around in my mind. Is that we tend to overestimate what we can accomplish in the short term, but we underestimate what we can accomplish in the long term. We struggle with staying with something for the long term. We get bored or we don't see the results that we want, whatever it is, and the tendency is to pull back and find something different to do, to find something new to do. But yet we overestimate how much energy and time and that we can put into the short term, thinking that we can accomplish all these things when in fact we can't. I mean, it makes me think of the Apostle Paul's life, in fact, because if there was anyone that understood what the impact of the long term can be, it's the Apostle Paul. At the very end of his life, he's writing a letter to his protege, the person he's been mentoring for years, named Timothy. And in 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 7, he says this really short sentence in there. He tells Timothy, he says, "I have fought the fight. I have ran the race. I have kept the faith." Paul says, look, Timothy, I have fought well. I've been beaten up. I've been bruised, but I have done that. I have ran the race that God has set before me. I haven't given up. I haven't veered to the right or veered to the left. I've stayed straight on the path, and I've done well, he says, Timothy. I have fought well. I have accomplished these things. I mean, what did Paul accomplish? Well, the fact that if you go to church on Sundays, and it doesn't matter what denomination that you are, well, that can be attributed to Paul's work in Paul's life. He's what we call the greatest missionary. He took Christianity all the way to Rome, which is where we all eventually came from, spiritually or in church-wise speaking. Is that Paul's life was these small increments of faithfulness throughout his life that led to something huge that God used to bring about the gospel in my life and to bring about the gospel in your life. Paul did not underestimate what he could accomplish in the long term. Now the question is, why did Paul do that? Did Paul do that on his own strength or in his own power? No, he didn't. In fact, Paul did it because of who Jesus is and of God's own faithfulness. You see, listen to what Lamentations chapter 3 says. That's talking about, Jeremiah the prophet is talking about God's faithfulness. And he says in verse 23, he says, or 22 and 23, "The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases." The steadfast love, that's faithfulness. "The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness." The reason why Paul did not overestimate his accomplishments in his short term and underestimate them in his long term is because Paul understood that as he was remaining faithful, God was more faithful. As Paul was living out his life and living out his ministry, living out his calling that God had given him, he knew and he trusted that God was more faithful than even Paul was. That when Paul failed, God would not. When Paul began to veer from his calling and his purpose in life, God never did. His faithfulness is new his mercies are new every morning. God is faithful. When we trust in God's faithfulness like that God's not going to leave us, He's not going to forsake us, He's not going to give up on us, that He's going to give us the mercies that we need to handle the problems of today, it keeps us walking faithfully with God. It keeps us walking on that straight line. I think of Paul, but I also think of my friend Robert, who I go to church with every Sunday. And this Friday, this past Friday, Robert got the call that no one ever wants to get. He got a call that he had tested positive for a hereditary brain disease that his mother died of, that his grandmother died of, and he knew in that moment that his fate is sealed and it's quickly coming. That this brain disease is going to systematically shut his body down, and it's going to be a horrible, it's just going to be a horrible death, a slow, agonizing death. But yet Robert, in that moment that he got this news, and as we talked on the phone, he knew that God was faithful. But he didn't just know it, because this morning, although he just received this horrible, tragic news, Robert walked into the church just like he does every single Sunday. He sat on the pew with me just like he does every single Sunday, and we worship together just like we do every other Sunday. Robert is faithful to what God has called him to do because God is more faithful. Where is it in your life that you are being tested, that you are being tested to trust in God's faithfulness, and you're wanting to veer off to the right or to the left or not do something that you know you should do? I want to encourage you, be like Paul, be like Robert, trust that God is faithful. He's not going to leave you. He's not going to forsake you. In fact, He's given you Jesus and the Holy Spirit to accomplish what you need to do in your life. Trust in God's faithfulness and be faithful in the short term and in the long term. Well, I hope you guys will have an awesome, a safe, and a productive work week.